Mr. President, Mrs. Prime Minister, dear guests, welcome to the University of Copenhagen. And to our two main speakers, I should say welcome back here. You have both visited this ceremonial hall before, and though your respective visits took place quite recently, the European agenda has changed dramatically since then. Perhaps the European Union now faces its most decisive hour. Mr. George Soros, who visited the University of Copenhagen just last week, has warned that the Eurozone has entered a, I quote, more lethal phase, end of quote, and he recommends measures that go further than the recently adopted Europact. Maybe Mr. Soros' analysis is too gloomy. Nonetheless, the current economic crisis has certainly underlined the necessity of promoting sustainable European growth. Politicians and citizens alike wonder how strategies, pacts, and restoration plans will affect the individual member states and the individual inhabitants in those states. And we ask ourselves, will the Union be further divided or further unified in the years to come? And are the member states politically willing and able to make reforms? I think every citizen in Europe should consider the overall background for the creation of the European Union back in the 1950s, and should also consider that even a united EU constitutes a still decreasing fraction of the world economy. Thus, I do not want to imagine the future of Europe again broken up into its parts. The EU has adopted the Europe 2020 growth strategy for the coming decade. The purpose is to become a smart, sustainable, and inclusive economy. And of course, at this university, we are pleased that the strategy maintains an important research target with 3% of the EU GDP to be invested in research. Along with the Horizon 2020 framework program for research and innovation, it sends a clear message that research and education are essential in promoting growth. President Barroso and Prime Minister Thorning-Schmidt, we hope you agree. We have been looking forward to hearing you debate how the European Union should proceed and what can be done to meet the current challenges. Now, I will give the floor to the international editor of one of our national newspapers, Politiken, Mr. Michael Jalner, who will guide us through today's program and introduce the speakers. Michael, the floor is yours.
In the run-up to this event, we ran some ads asking two questions: how can we trigger economic growth? What divides and what unifies EU? After Sunday's election in France, we could add questions like, what do we do now? Where are we now after an election in France, one of the core countries in EU, where 65% of the voters supposed candidates opposed or very critical to the fiscal treaty? What should we do after a Sunday where the coalition in Holland broke down because of a discomfort in the political system against the EU treaty? So going back to the questions in the ads, it's easier to see what divides Europe than what unifies Europe. We would like to know how will EU respond to the voters in France, the voters or the political system in Holland? And what do EU do in a situation where EU is seen more as a problem rather than the solution to ordinary people's problems with unemployment, poverty, and all those things back on the agenda in Europe? I'm happy we can ask the question to two of the main players in the EU field, our own Prime Minister, Helle Thorning-Schmidt, you, Mr. President of the EU, Manuel Barroso. But before we come to you, we will welcome our assistant professor here from Copenhagen University, Rebecca Adler-Nielsen, who will give a small presentation or a small framework for the discussion to come here. So welcome to you and welcome to all of you.
Thank you very much. Dear President, dear Prime Minister, dear Rector, dear guests. Today, 50% of the young Spanish population is unemployed. And demonstrators fill the streets of Athens. And some people ask, why are the changes necessary? And others ask, why don't we do more? Jan Patočka, the Czech philosopher and founder of the Charter 77 movement, was tortured to death by Czech police in 1977. And he talked about the horrors of the First World War and what he called the experience of the front. And the experience of the front is the soldiers meeting with fear and shock at the war. Patočka says that it is only out of this darkness that any knowledge, any light emerges. At the front, the soldier recognizes himself in the enemy, and in this common nightmare of the war, a solidarity of the shaken people is created. This leads to a sense of responsibility. Now, how will the current crisis affect European integration? The social sciences, and in particular European integration theories, have, to say the least, quite some problems answering these questions. Some scholars today would say, well, there is actually no crisis. It's invented, or at least it's not the EU's problem. Others would see this crisis as the Titanic moment, the very situation that will bring down not only the EU's major economies, but threaten the very political raison d'etre for the Union. So the crisis from this perspective appears to be not only economic, but also political and even existential. From this perspective, the EU will never be the same again. So while we struggle with our theories in the university, I think we can already see three major trends or consequences of the crisis for European integration. The first one is that the financial and economic crisis have removed important political taboos. So the crisis has basically paved the way for reforms and for an economic political cooperation that just a few years ago people would have thought was impossible or even unimaginable because it was too sensitive for the member states. Interestingly, contrary to the 1970s where we had the oil crisis, we saw attempts to roll back integration and even undermine the internal market. But we have not seen such developments in this crisis, at least not yet. On the contrary, member states have actually worked closer together and taken common initiatives. However, when the member states have made these dramatic decisions, and some would say they're not dramatic enough, some would say they go in the wrong direction, but when they have made these dramatic decisions, it's not out of political will as much as out of a sense of economic necessity. So this is a different kind of integration than the old federal ideal. So many of these dramatic decisions, I think, would have been taking place even without the EU. Second, the economic crisis has accelerated the move towards what we call differentiated integration. Basically, we see an increasing divide between the EU in a core and a periphery. And the euro is the dividing line. When I interviewed a Dutch diplomat a few years ago in Brussels, he said to me very politely, possibly because I was a Dane, that, well, for me, it's really the euro that counts. It decides whether you're in or out. If you're not part of the euro, you're not part of the real thing. In Berlin last year, President Barroso said, well, the speed of the EU cannot be the speed of the slowest member. Indeed, the question of whether the EU will split up is not the question. The question is how. What kind of multi-speed Europe is workable in practice? How can it avoid undermining the common legal order, the internal market, the equality between the member states, and how can we hold a differentiated Europe democratically accountable? The third consequence of the crisis that we already see now is a change in what we could call the power dynamics in Brussels. When Denmark took over the EU presidency in January 2012, Prime Minister Helle Thorning-Schmidt delivered what I would call a historic speech in the European Parliament. She said, "As I stand here today as Prime Minister of Denmark, I can assure you of my personal commitment to Europe. I am a European at heart." That is striking for a Dane to say that, but apart from former Danish Prime Minister Jens Otto Krag, I think we could safely say that Thorning-Schmidt is probably the most European Prime Minister that Denmark has had to date. The other striking sentence in the speech was when she said, "During times of crisis, when tough decisions and compromises need to be made, our community method is more important than ever." Now, the community method is the normal decision-making process in the EU. It's the process where the Commission has the monopoly to propose new legislation, the member states decide with qualified majority voting, and the European Parliament is co-legislator, and the European Court controls it all. Now, Thorning-Schmidt indirectly pointed to the way in which the crisis has weakened the community method and strengthened the tendency that the EU's agenda is set bilaterally by the bigger member states in cooperation with President Van Rompuy, at the expense of transparency, the smaller member states, and, I would argue, the Commission. 2 decades ago, most small member states would say, well, bilateral intergovernmentalism and even led by big member states, that is what is most safe. Today, they understand the costs. So the various trends point both in direction of more cooperation, but also more differentiation. The crisis, however, has not led to any kind of disintegration. Whether we will arrive at some kind of solidarity of the shaken, a kind of common feeling or sense or agreement of what the crisis is all about, is more uncertain. What we know from Jan Patočka, the great European, is that any kind of crisis is not only a nightmare, but it's also a birth or a place for new academic, political, cultural debate, and it's something that reminds us that what we construct together is always deeply political. So this is why I'm looking very much forward to the kind of thoughts we will hear now from two of the most central people in the European integration today. Thank you.
Now I will give the floor to you, Mr. José Manuel Barroso. You came as a president for the EU Commission in the heydays just after the enlargement of EU. Now you struggle to keep EU together. I guess after the French election and after the second round, you'll have an even harsher, tougher work to do. But welcome to you. The floor is yours.
Prime Minister, Mr. Rector, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, it is a real pleasure to be here for this debate with you today. It is indeed my second time in the University of Copenhagen. Copenhagen is not only the oldest university in Denmark, but also one of the most respected academic institutions in Europe, a university which sums up much of what is best about Europe: a sense of inquiry, the search for excellence, and an openness to ideas and people. It is no surprise that Helle Thorning-Schmidt and many of her predecessors as Prime Minister studied here, along with many other distinguished students, including an impressive number of Nobel Prize winners. Today's students will leave the university with a wide range of attributes and skills. But despite this, I will not be surprised if many of you view the future with some concern. Across Europe, financial and economic crisis has brought instability and uncertainty. The job market is a very tough place. Levels of unemployment are unacceptably high, particularly among the young people. Europeans are asking themselves if the next generation will have a better life compared to the generation before. The immediate challenges we face are due to unsustainable public finances, financial instability, and an overall lack of competitiveness. We can and are taking short-term measures to relieve the immediate impact. These are already having an effect. We have a second package for Greece. Member states are taking measures towards fiscal consolidation and making essential structural reforms to improve their competitiveness. We have strengthened regulation and supervision of the financial markets, and we have put in place a reinforced system of economic governance for Europe, namely for the euro area, but not only for the euro area. Most importantly, the European Union has committed to and is already implementing an overarching strategy for growth, Europe 2020. But we are not yet out of the crisis. The situation remains fragile. We need to complete these reforms to restore stability, which is a prerequisite for growth. And growth is the real long-term challenge in a rapidly changing world. If Europe wants to prosper in the future and maintain our values, our social models, our quality environment, we need to invest now in the changes that will ensure what we call smart, inclusive, sustainable growth in the future. And we must do it together. Indeed, we can only succeed if we do it together for obvious reasons. Even the biggest of our member states, they simply don't have the dimension to come to agreements in an equal footing with the biggest poles of the economic situation in the world, our American friends or China and others. How can a country with 60 million people, not to speak countries that have less than 10 million people, think that they can discuss in an equal footing with countries with 1.2 or 1.4 billion people in the future? The world is changing completely. We are in the 21st century now. And the dimension counts. And if we want to defend our values, our social market economy, if we want to defend, for instance, our policy on climate, we need the dimension of the European Union. If not, we simply will not have the leverage. We simply will not have the influence. And so member states will face irrelevance if they don't commit to a stronger European Union. That is my real perception of these 8 years I take now as leading the European Commission, but that was already my position before I was in the Commission. I want you to know this, because it's very important to look at the European Union as we are in the 21st century, and not as it was in the middle of last century, where, by the way, the European Union was or started as a group of 6 countries. And now we are a union of 27. And as Professor Nissen very rightly said, quoting Potoshka, he was tortured in his country. And now most of Europe is free. And we have 27 countries that are united in Europe because they decided to be members of Europe. So I cannot be pessimistic when I remember the Europe we had before, when my own country or countries of the European Union in the South were living under authoritarian regimes. We have no freedom. Or all Central Eastern European countries were under totalitarian communist regimes. And today they are living in freedom and they are united in a continental project that is the European Union. And so it is why we have to look at things in perspective. Yes, we have a crisis. Nobody is complacent about the crisis. And it is indeed a serious crisis. But if you look how Europe was 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 60 years, it was in this continent that we had the Shoah. It was in this continent that we had the worst moments in history of mankind, when some countries tried to put an end to all kinds of freedom. And today we have difficulties. Yes, we have difficulties. But we have the dimension and the capability and the instruments to face those difficulties. And this is why I say with a great conviction that a sustainable solution for the crisis means more Europe, not less Europe. And we have to fight hard against prejudices. People, for instance, suggesting that the crisis is a result of the euro. Simply not true. Against all facts. We have countries that are not in the euro and that they have situations that are at least as serious as those who are in the euro. We have even countries that are not in the European Union and they have the kind of problems we have. And some of them, in fact, are now trying to join the European Union, like Iceland, for instance. It was not the euro that created the crisis. It's simply false when people say that. And I'm sure that in a scientific environment like the university, you will resist any kind of prejudices. And let's look at the facts and not just be biased by any kind of misperceptions or even prejudices. This is why we need this dimension at European level, to maximize the benefits of our citizens. Democratically elected governments have chosen to engage in deeper integration, to pool resources, and to come together to achieve results which no European state could deliver alone. Let me take a concrete example, climate change. Acting as a union, we have a greater say in international negotiations, and through our concerted actions, we are setting indeed the global agenda. We have taken a bold step by putting a price on carbon dioxide emissions. No individual member state could have taken such a step alone. Improving environmental standards, research, innovation are just some of the areas in which growth tomorrow depends on investment today. Here too, the European Union also plays a vital role through its budget. The EU budget channels resources into investment in infrastructure, networks, and research on a European scale to support the efficiency and sustainability of our economy. In times of austerity, €1 spent in the EU budget can save several euros for national budgets. The ongoing work on the Baltic-Denmark gas interconnector is a good example of a project where only a cross-border effort can ensure energy supply and security within a European region. The message is clear: when we are united, we will benefit. Just as important, we all benefit from being open, both between ourselves and towards the wider world. I don't think I have to make this point in Denmark. More than 60% of your exports go to the European Union member states. Just imagine what could be the results if we start to have kind of renationalization or the fragmentation of the internal market. That would be detrimental for your companies, but for your workers, for you as young people that want one day, of course, to give a better contribution still to your country. That is why internal protectionism or external protectionism is simply wrong. And it does not serve our interests, neither in the short nor in the long term. Openness brings benefits. Openness within Europe has brought huge benefits through the single market. Economic growth, but also new opportunities, including for students. Among the priorities for the future EU budget, we have proposed to double the number of students who can benefit from the Erasmus program, opening opportunities for up to 5 million individuals. We are also doing more to help young people when they leave school or university. Unemployment among those aged under 25 years is at record levels, as was already stated. That is why the Commission has presented the Youth Opportunities Initiative to help graduates get the first experience of work, to increase the mobility of young workers, and to provide €3 million of technical assistance to young people starting a business. Just last week, we launched a new campaign called We Mean Business, which in 2012 and 2013 will create 280,000 work placements for vocational and higher education students. We also want to help young people to turn inspired ideas into blooming businesses. The Innovation Union is one of the flagship initiatives of the Europe 2020 agenda. It aims both to strengthen research and provide support necessary to commercialize the results. The Commission has also made proposals for a venture capital passport to improve SMEs' financing opportunities. And as the world's emerging economies continue to increase their contribution to global economic growth, Europe also has a clear interest in maintaining an open attitude in our external policies and encouraging others, of course, to do the same. We must be ready to engage ever more deeply with our international partners to increase opportunities for European companies in their markets. Dear students, I have spoken of the need for a united Europe and an open Europe. At the end, it comes always to this: united Europe and open Europe. The current crisis has also shown that a common currency, the euro, requires further economic integration, greater coordination and discipline. And as was already highlighted by Professor Nilsson in his introductory remarks, indeed, and this is sometimes may appear as a paradox, because it goes against the prevailing mood. Indeed, member states have agreed unprecedented levels of coordination and discipline. Some of those points that were simply not acceptable, I would say, really unthinkable just 5 years ago. I know, because we have discussed this with them some time ago. We have discussed this, and it was unthinkable. We could not do it. And now, precisely because the member states had the experience of this level of interdependence, they are ready to accept what was simply not admissible some time ago, because we are really united in our market and we need this dimension. The euro needs this. It is not just the federalists, it's the market. Now the markets are asking us, are you ready to sustain your currency? not only what is the deficit of Greece, but what is the political will of Germany? This is the question the markets are asking. Because if you want to have a currency, a common currency, we need to have some levels of integration. That is why I insist the euro is the currency of the European Union. There are two countries who have opt-outs, and we respect that, Denmark and United Kingdom. But the euro is the currency of the European Union, and that is why we cannot make a division based on the euro. Because if we make a division based on the euro, we will put at risk the internal market. And the internal market is the basis, the necessary basis for growth and prosperity in Europe. That's why I want to state very clearly that we are against new divisions in the European Union. There are some mechanisms in the treaties, the reinforced cooperation, but they are treaty-based, they are okay regarding the rules. But what we have to accept is that for obvious reasons, just a question of common sense, we need more, let's say, integration in the governance of the euro area, but that should be compatible with keeping the level playing field of the European Union, of the single market, of the so-called four freedoms. In fact, not only the four freedoms of capital, markets, capital, services, goods, and people, but also a fifth freedom, the freedom of knowledge. That's why we are so committed to the European research area. And that's exactly what we are now doing. My answer is that the necessary strengthening of integration for the euro can and should happen in a way that respects the two principles of unity and openness. And decisions on issues like the single market or cohesion, which will affect all member states, must involve all member states. These are questions which I know are often discussed in Denmark. In Denmark, your country is outside the euro area, yet your financial markets and economy are closely interconnected with it, and this interdependence impacts on the daily lives and well-being of the Danes. We, Commission, are charged with ensuring that the law, the equality of member states, the role of the EU institutions are respected. This was the European Commission's main objective in the discussions on the Treaty on Stability, Coordination and Governance signed by 25 member states in March, including Denmark, which I really welcome. This treaty represents the very culture of financial stability that is a prerequisite for true economic union, the necessary counterpoint to monetary union. The European Commission would have preferred this to be a new treaty, but there was not the necessary unanimity among member states. But the new fiscal pact fully reflects the community method, respects the role of the EU institutions, includes democratic safeguards, and its content will be rolled back into the EU treaties within 5 years. Because I want to underline this, the European Union is a union of law. We are not just a union of member states, because in the past also many European countries, they were in international cooperation in Europe, and some of the countries were simply not democratic. They were simply not respecting the rule of law. In the EFTA, in the European Free Trade Association and Agreement, there were countries that were simply not democracies. In the European Union, you cannot stay in the European Union if you are not a democracy. And our union is based on the rule of law. That is why it is important, is because this is the way to ensure fairness, to ensure, for instance, that big member states will not take decisions alone and leave the other member states smaller or not so rich in a detrimental position. That is why I want to finish my point with this. We are a union of values. Yes, it started with the common market. Yes, it started around the economic integration. But what we need now is to understand that the European Union was based with a political aim, namely the aim of peace. After the two world wars that started in Europe, to some extent they were in fact European civil wars. The goal is a political one for a political future for Europe. And we are based on values, the values of freedom and the values of solidarity. I think these values are something that we should stand for, and we have the courage to defend globally, respecting the other partners, but being sure that we can defend our own values, what we usually call our social market economy, and we can do it in a much stronger and more efficient way if we do it together. I thank you for your attention.
And now I give the floor to our own Prime Minister, Mrs. Helle Thorning-Schmidt, who is also the president of EU. You have been very supportive of the French-German architectured fiscal treaty. Now it seems as though France is not so supportive anymore and will not be after the second round of the presidential election. So we are eager to know how will you respond as a chairman of the Danish Social Democrats, and how will you respond as EU president. Welcome to this meeting.
Thank you very much, President Barroso, Rector Hemmingsen, Assistant Professor Adler Nissen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for inviting me here today, and thank you all for participating in this meeting. It is always great to be back to my old university in this room as well. It's an amazing place. So I also want to thank, in general, the university and also the European Commission for organizing what has, seen from the outside, been a great, very successful series of public debates about the EU. As I see the debates, many of the most difficult and urgent challenges has been discussed. And as Prime Minister, as a politician, I appreciate the input and the inspiration provided by exactly these discussions. This is what Europe is also about, to meet and discuss politics. I am a firm believer in a spirited and public debate as an instrument to help us get new ideas, to help us to shape government decisions, and in particular, I feel that a debate in a university with lots of young people participating is what Europe is all about. What we are trying to do these months, these years, is to shape the Europe that you will basically inherit. And perhaps this kind of debate is more important when times are tough, as they are right now. The interdependence between the European member states is very, very clear, and that means that the crisis has an impact everywhere in Europe, in every corner of Europe. What we're seeing these days is that millions of Europeans are finding themselves at the receiving end of cutbacks, layoffs, bankruptcies, rising debt, and frozen housing market. And that is also why I continue to argue the need for a Europe that sticks together and acts in concert, and that there's a need for this which is greater than it perhaps have been for a long, long time. The European debt crisis cannot be handled by any individual member state, acting alone and acted in an uncoordinated fashion. There is no doubt in my mind, to handle this crisis, member states must cooperate, make compromises, and align their different capabilities in order to achieve maximum firepower. The economic crisis, and I want to be completely frank about that, the economic crisis has, of course, put the cooperation within the EU under strain. It has, however, made it abundantly clear that the way forward goes through enhanced cooperation, stronger common rules, and more joint action. In the last many months, during the crisis, a lot of people have criticized the EU for not taking appropriate action together. I must say that I strongly oppose this view, because the actions over the last months have showed that the EU is willing to act together and act in solidarity. Look at it. The fiscal compact, the new bailout program for Greece, the strengthening of the firewall, and the structural reforms on the way at national levels, all these is common actions that where we have shown that we are capable of acting together. And many countries have started, and they have started because they have been under certain pressure from the EU to get started. Ireland, Italy, Spain have now initiated substantial labour market reforms that will make a difference. A wide range of countries are liberalising their product and service markets and taking new steps to enhance competitions. And these are all examples of an EU and its member states willing to take necessary and far-reaching decisions. And let's not forget that these decisions were taken as we were moving, because the decisions had to be taken very fast. And just a few months ago, let's just look 4 months ago, 5 months ago, no one could have envisaged how far we could actually reach today. And I also feel that these decisions were perhaps impossible a few years ago. But let me also underline that recent development has shown that the debt crisis is far from over, and we are still in a situation where we have to act together. We need to keep our efforts, and we need to conduct in all the member states sound fiscal policies. This is what we're also trying to do in this member state, Denmark. And we feel that what we are doing at the national level, but also at the European level, could be of importance to Europe. Thanks to Denmark's particular history in Europe, being a small country outside the Eurozone with a fixed exchange rate vis-à-vis the euro, our presidency has proven to be well placed in being a bridge builder in the Europe that needed a bridge build. Today there is a widespread recognition amongst member states that by pulling together politically and economically at this very difficult point in time, Europe might come out stronger on the other side than we had envisaged just a few months ago. And the lesson is that whatever one country chooses to do, it will affect the rest, and that our solutions must be carried out in coordination with one another. All member states need to keep their own house in order. And let's remember that the crisis was not created at the European level, but was basically created because the member states didn't keep their own house in order. And when we are asking each and every member state to sort out their economy and keep their economy in order, we are asking them now not only to do that for themselves, but also for the sake of the whole of the Union. And we also understand now that our individual sovereignty, our individual room for maneuver, depend on actions on others with whom we share trade, borders and values. It has always been like that, but the crisis had made it even clearer to us that that is the way it is. And knowing this, we must take the appropriate measures to move Europe forward. And that is why, from the very outset, the Danish presidency remains committed to a positive agenda for Europe, an agenda focused on stimulating economic growth and promoting job creation. Basically, when we talk about consolidating our economies in all the different European member states, it is always about that being the foundation for creating new growth and jobs in the whole of Europe. That is why, from the outside, we have not invented big new schemes that we wanted to carry through. We have looked at what we got at hand and how we can improve the foundation for creating new growth. We have tried to look into many policy areas. We are trying to bring forward the 12 initiatives that will modernize the single market and improve the business climate in Europe, because we are of the firm belief that if we can do that, we will create a new foundation for growth. And last month, we concluded with the European Parliament a revision of the roaming regulation, and we soon hope to adopt a new regulation for a standardization system in Europe. These are important dossiers. They perhaps not sound that big, but these are important dossiers because these are the foundation of how we can create new growth and jobs in Europe. And I'm absolutely convinced that this will help the spread of new technology, reduce administrative burdens on companies, and that will form the new basis of growth. In the ongoing negotiations on the next EU budget, we have the same view. We want an EU budget that is building on what we have, and also an EU budget that creates growth for the future. That means promoting growth-enhancing areas of our budget, such as research, education, energy efficiency, and green technologies. We should, of course, use our common budget to create a new foundation for new growth in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, the theme for our discussion today, the future of the EU moving forward together, implies that Europe is at a crossroads where we need to choose. But is the choice really, as it is often portrayed, is the choice really between on the one hand, old-style European politics, with a few great powers dominating their smaller neighbors on a divided continent, or, on the other hand, a situation where we are forced to plunge ourselves into new treaties leading to a United States of Europe? Is the choice only between those two paths? I don't think so. I don't believe that any of those two destinations for Europe will find much favor with the majority of citizens in Europe, and nor are they in our interest. What I do believe is that Europe will be capable of working its way out of the current crisis through a relentless focus on achieving tangible results, and by applying our expanded economic toolbox that we have now created in a clever way. And in a way, this is what European integration has always been about. Not building new fantasy houses, but by finding pragmatic and flexible solutions to common challenges. When I look at Europe over the last months, we started with crisis, where we only talked about crisis management. But I think we lived up to the expectations and took some decisions that has moved us ahead. And I think we should be proud of our results. And I promise you, this is what we will continue to do. We will never give up. We're not built like that. In times of crisis, we create a new toolbox and we create the solutions that are necessary to move forward. And just in a few months, we have managed to move Europe a little bit forward. So we are not in a situation that we were just a few months ago, where everyone was discussing, will Europe survive? Will Europe survive? Yes, we will. We will survive. We will be able to take new decisions together, because what we have built is much stronger than this crisis. And perhaps, if we are very good and very clever, we will come out of this crisis even stronger than we were before. This is my hope for Europe.
Thank you very much. The idea with these meetings is also to shorten the distance between decision makers and the voters. So now the floor is yours. We are very short of time. We have to be very short, precise, and direct. So we start with 3 questions from the floor to the honored guest up here, and who will start. Please stand up, present yourself, and ask one precise, short question. Who will start? I see a forest of hands. I can go myself then. Yes? You will have a microphone. Yeah.
Hi. Hi, thank you so much for coming here and speaking to us today. I just wanted to ask Mr. Barroso, again, he was talking about the 4 freedoms, and he added a 5th freedom of knowledge, and I wanted to know how this differed from the freedom of ideas that already had existed.
What we are trying to build is a European research area. Can I?
Oh, I was just taking in three questions, but
okay.
if you are so eager to answer, I shall not stop you. No, you just
Sad to
go
go
ahead.
to the
Go
point.
ahead, because then people will raise their hands while you're answering.
Okay. Now, as I mentioned, as you know, the European Union was built, the European community, on these 4 freedoms. Freedom of people, of capital, of goods, and of services. And we, Commission, have been speaking about the freedom of knowledge in the sense of creating a European research area. Because today, in fact, we don't have yet that. Here you are in one of the best universities in Europe, but not all the universities are at this level. And when you go to the States, and I've been there also teaching at universities in the United States, the National Science Foundation there, they make plans for all the United States, okay? They don't make a distinction between Florida or California or New York or Delaware or Washington State. And in Europe today, we have not yet this. We have a very fragmented research area. So I want to do is, by the way, that's the proposal. I'm very happy to support that the Danish presidency, Prime Minister Thorning-Schmidt just mentioned, the importance for the budget as investment for the future, including in research and innovation. That's one of the areas where we need to put some of our money, to have the dimension, to have the synergies for researchers to go from one country to the other without restrictions. You can say we can't travel. Yes, we can, but for instance, there are technical problems. You know, the portability of pensions. The portability of pension of researchers, it's a problem. I've been in several of in Cambridge University, and the director of Cambridge University was telling me, we want to have some of the Germans, but they cannot come here because they have accumulated their pensions. So these are some concrete issues, but that in fact are concrete barriers to a real space for research in Europe, and I believe that can be a way of enhancing our capability also globally and also for growth and employment in Europe.
Is it okay if I go back to my plan about the 3 questions? I have one in the back here, and can I ask you kindly to be short in your answers too, because we want as many answers as possible. Down here, and then I have a woman in red over here. Yes. And first you. Yeah.
Hi. Mr. Barroso, thank you for coming here. But I had a question. Many suggest that also cap reforms would also help this Euro crisis. And currently there's many issues with subsidy rights, with small farmers being able to even purchase these subsidy rights to finance their farming and create more economic growth, and that large, wealthier people are being able to purchase these rights and squeeze out the small farmers that aren't able to purchase these rights in large quantities. So what would you do to help create more cap reform to aid the current crisis?
And then we take a question over here. The woman in red. It's on its way.
Thank you. My name is Anna Mosniaga. I'm a PhD student at the University of Copenhagen. And I would like to ask Mr. Barroso, you mentioned some initiatives about averting the youth crisis, especially the unemployment crisis, and by increasing their employability and so on. Can you give some concrete initiatives about, or examples of concrete initiatives about how we're going to ensure that all this youth that is taking higher education, being mobile and so on, will be secured with jobs according to their qualifications? Because there's simply too many people that are educated and not enough jobs for their levels of education.
And then we take number 3 up here on the first row. You'll have a mic too.
Thank you very much. My name is Christian Liborius, and I study law here at the university. I have a question for Prime Minister Thorning-Schmidt. I read an interview with Angela Merkel a couple of months ago where she offered us her vision of the European future. Hers was a very bold, federalistic one. I was wondering, what's your vision? How do you view our union in 10, 20 years? And also maybe if I could get the assistant professor's view on that issue. What's the future of our union?
Thank you very much. And who will start from the panel here? Mr. Barroso, you will start?
Okay. Regarding the CAP reform, the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, in fact, it has been reformed for many years. It is true that a large part of our budget is for common agricultural policy. It is important to understand why. It was a founding policy of the European Union, and in fact, it's an integrated policy. So differently, for instance, for education, where most of the expenditure comes from national level, the CAP, it's in fact everything member states can put on the agricultural policy. And if you look to others, for instance, if you look to Switzerland, it's not a member of the European Union. I can tell you, they give a lot of support to their agriculture as well, at least to keep the agriculture in the mountains, for instance. And I could give you many other examples. So I'm telling you this because sometimes there are some prejudices against CAP, as if CAP was completely out of proportion. And it is true that it involves a very large share of the European budget, but for these reasons. Nevertheless, it has been reduced over the years. Now, in the last proposal we have made also, we gave more space to other policies like innovation, research, and so on, and some interconnections in Europe, not only interconnections in transport, but on energy, namely for renewables. For instance, to make it possible for renewables to go from the north of Europe, on wind, to the south, and solar from the south to the north. So we are looking at this in a comprehensive manner. This precise issue about the subsidies and for people to buy or not to buy farms, I'm not contemplating that. What we are doing as very essential in terms of reform is what we call the greening of CAP. So to have at least 30% of the expenditure with common agricultural policy to be for sustainable farming, so for the farming to give also contribution to our climate objectives and our environment objectives. I think it's a very way of having a modern common agricultural policy. This is the most important part of the reform we are doing. We are also proposing another reform, but some member states do not agree, is to put a ceiling so that the biggest farms don't receive more than a certain amount. And it's quite interesting that some of the governments that are opposing more the CAP are exactly the ones who want to keep these very high subsidies for big exploitations. We believe we should not have, so we should have a kind of a cap in the cap. We should have a maximum for exploitation. The other issue was about
job creation.
Job creation. I already mentioned in my speech some concrete initiatives. The one is called Youth Opportunities Initiative. The idea is to have, in a period of 4 months after graduation, the member states to give a kind of a guarantee that either the young people, they find a job, or if not, they will be supported through a traineeship or apprenticeships. And in fact, we are already doing that at least with 8 countries in Europe that have the highest unemployment level of young people. I've sent teams of the Commission to work with those 8 countries. Denmark is not one of those. Denmark, even if there is also high unemployment in young people, is comparatively much better than others. And what we are proposing those member states is to redirect, to redeploy the funds from the structural funds, namely the social fund, for concrete employment or traineeship, apprenticeships, namely in SMEs, in small, medium-sized companies. This is a concrete measure that is already been now deployed. We are deploying it on the ground. Just last week, we launched this campaign, Women in Business. The goal is to create 280,000 work placements for vocational and higher education students. We also have now put some proposals for venture capital. This is very important for young people because many of the problems we have is the launching of initiatives for startups that in Europe, compared with our American partners, they don't have the same kind of support from the beginning. So I want to tell you that this is very much in the priorities of the European Union, even if this is, I want to underline, mainly a national responsibility. Employment is a national responsibility. What we can do at European level is to help with some overall guidance. Just last week, we proposed the employment package, communication, just last week, to give the member states some of the framework for some reforms they can do also in the labor market to make, let's say, easier for young people, including graduated young people, to get a job for their future life.
And Helle Thorning-Schmidt.
One question was for me about where we're going in the European Union. I want to make one thing clear first. First of all, the response we had to this European crisis was the right response. It was the fiscal compact and and focus on how we can, at the European level, create more growth and jobs. So that was clearly the right response. It was swift, and no one had expected that we could act with that firmness which we did in Europe. So that was the right response. But I also want to say very, very clearly that often when we have a problem that we need to solve in Europe, the question is not always institutional. And there is a tendency always to answer problems at the European level with institutions. And I feel that is not always the right way to answer the crisis. When we have a crisis now, which is a job crisis, a growth crisis, the answer is more trade with the rest of the world, a reform of the single market, more competitiveness in Europe, each member state bringing their own house in order, and other issues. But the last question, the last answer we need is an institutional answer. I appreciate the fiscal compact. It was wise and it was necessary. But I do feel that in this situation we have now, what Europe is want right now is not a big institutional debate. They want concrete results that can be felt in each and every member state and can be felt in terms of getting new jobs, particularly for the young people. So if you're asking me about Europe in 10, 15 years, I will owe you an answer. But the answer right now is not institutional. It is about focusing on what we can do. And there are a lot of things we can do because what people are asking is jobs, not institutional changes.
But what impression does it leave to you when you see French voters, like 65% voting for candidates against the fiscal compound? What do you think as an EU president when you see something like that?
Well, it is absolutely clear that the debate about Europe the last many months, a lot of people are extremely frustrated about the lack of responsibility from the financial markets, the lack of jobs, particularly for the young people, and I completely understand that frustration. But I also feel that the frustration is easily put in the direction of the European Union, whereas lots of the frustration should be put in the direction of the individual governments of the member state. I have to remind, I know this is provoking a lot of people, but the crisis was not created by the European Union, because it wasn't the European Union that didn't have fiscal prudence, it was the member states. And that is why it is very interesting that everyone is asking for the European Union to answer the questions now, but the problem was actually created by the member states.
But the demands are set by the Union. But I go to Bettina.
Yeah, Bettina. Thank you for that very good question about where the EU will be in 10, 15 years. I probably also owe you a real good answer, but I try to sort of the first question is the F word you mentioned, the federalist word. I'd say, well, basically the EU is almost a federation already. So in that sense, you could say that the Chancellor, the German Chancellor, is basically just stating what we political scientists already know, namely that there is a division of labor, and you have two chambers, you have the council, you have the parliament, you have a court, supranational court. All you need is a direct election of President Barroso, and then you almost have an American system. Of course, that's only one answer, but I think it's important to say that we might not use the F word, but the F word is actually quite useful to understand what the EU looks like. In terms of how the EU will develop, I think that the best image, for better or worse, is probably that the EU will move from a European Union to a European Onion. That is, a more concentric layers of states. We know that the EU will enlarge, thanks to the Danish presidency, with new member states, and we will need, the EU will need to tackle somehow, we haven't mentioned the Arab Spring, but there is a whole North Africa, and somehow the EU relates to this. And in this sense, what characterizes the EU in the future is probably this layered construction, where there is a core, even more federalist maybe than we see today. Maybe that is not the good word. We need more theories on this, but I think that will be the characteristic sort of image of the EU.
Can I just add one thing? I don't know how it is going to be in 20 years, but next year Croatia will join the European Union. Just now with the Danish presidency, it was agreed to give candidate status to Serbia. So if the European Union is so bad, why no one wants to leave and so many want to join? We are making progress in negotiations with Iceland. Iceland. It's a country not far from Denmark, relatively, but in the north of Europe, not only the Balkans. And I mention Iceland, why? Because as Prime Minister Thorning-Schmidt just said, it was not the euro that created the crisis. The crisis was created either by unsustainable public finances or by irresponsible financial behavior. That in fact did not start in Europe, but Europe was also contaminated by that. And now Iceland is asking to join. So this is the best confidence you can have in Europe, is that there are more members wanting to join it. Now, the issue that was already addressed several times by Professor Nielsen and very interesting is, how can we do it in terms of differentiation? And then my position is clear. We should avoid any kind of stratification. We cannot have one first-class Europe and a second-class of Europe. So while we have to accept that for the euro area there are some mechanisms of integrated governance, because it's obvious, it's a question of common sense, we have to be sure that everything takes place inside what we call the community method and the community institutions, that there are no discrimination. That countries that are not in the euro, like for instance Denmark, that keeps an opt-out, that because of that, they are not put in a disadvantaged position when it comes, for instance, about decisions about cohesion or decisions about the single market. And this is the question. So I prefer to say flexibility instead of even differentiation. Or certainly, we don't want stratification. Now, the problem is, afterwards, how to do it. To do it precisely with independent institutions. That is why when we speak about the community method, it is not for the sake of the European Commission. Look, I'm now in the Commission, but I've been a national leader. I was Prime Minister, leader of the opposition, many years in my own country. And I really believe that without strong independent institutions, like the European Commission, like the European Central Bank, like the European Court of Justice, to be sure that we respect, all the member states respect the law, what happens? The biggest will have more power than the smaller ones. The rules will not be applied or implemented in an objective way. That is why we need some kind of institutions, not for the sake of having, let's say, powers for Brussels, no, to be sure that we have a level playing field and that the European Union is built on fairness. That's why I believe in the European Union in the future will be stronger if it respects and deepens the community method.
We are in a red time zone. I'll just take the last two questions. One down here, yeah? And then one on the last row here.
Hello, my name is Antonios, and I'm a master's student of social science here in the university. My question is addressed to Helle Thorning-Schmidt, the Prime Minister of a Scandinavian welfare state. We have seen the EU supporting the non-elected Prime Ministers of Italy and Greece in order to enforce exhausting austerity measures, and despite the people's fierce opposition. In addition, we have seen the EU adopting market-driven policies which create recession and unemployment, diminish the welfare system, and destroy social cohesion. Therefore, I would like to ask to hear the reasons why you, as the leader of the European Council and despite your social democratic background, embrace these autocratic neoliberal policies, and at what social cost will the EU move forward?
Thank you very much. And then we take the question down here. Can you wait till later on? Take a question down here.
Sezer Özcan, PhD student at Bielefeld University. My questions are very briefly. How do you see the future of energy in Europe? Do you think that there will be a common energy policy at the EU level? And according to Mr. Barroso, following the gas crisis, do you think that energy should be securitized by member states?
Okay.
Thank you.
A very direct question to you, Helle Thorning-Schmidt. How could you support the Greek rescue package, as I heard it, as a social democrat?
First of all, I'd like to make it absolutely clear that there is nothing social democratic about not having a budget that balances. Because what happens if you don't have a balanced budget? What happens is that you say to the youth, not only can you not get a job right now, but we are also not willing to take the decisions, tough decisions necessary to ensure that you have the same opportunities of having a welfare state or having a sound economy as our generation had. That is why it is our task, whether we like it or not, in our generation of politicians to take those kinds of decisions. Because we should not be responsible for passing on a huge debt to the future generation. And what we have done to Greece is, I feel, a big help, because they had a budget that was not balanced, to say the least. And what they have had is a huge help package, a firewall, and also and a help to get out of the crisis that they have. If you look at it, Europe has acted with great solidarity, and I can say that because Denmark is not a Euro country. So it's the Euro countries that has acted with great solidarity towards a fellow member state. I hope that the Greeks will appreciate this help, but also see it as a sign that we want a whole union that is moving forward together. So I am completely convinced that what we're doing right now with the fiscal compact, that yes, has new discipline for Europe, but also form the basis of how we can move forward, forming a sound economic basis on how we can create more growth in Europe. There's no, as I see it, there's no contradiction between having a healthy budget that balances and also creating a new foundation for growth in Europe. And this is exactly what we want to do now. In the old days, they had a term which they called flexicurity. It was flexibility combined with security. I think it was something that was invented in the Scandinavian countries, flexicurity. What we need now is austerity combined with growth. And someone said to me the other day, it's growth-starity that we need. I don't know if it's a good expression, but there is no growth without sound budgets, and there is no sound budget unless we have growth. So those two things are completely connected, and that is why I feel extremely comfortable that Denmark is one of the first countries that will ratify the fiscal compact. We are actually quite proud of that, and at the same time, we are a country that has now got a kickstart, moving towards healthy budgets, because if we want to give the next generation a fair chance of having just the same opportunities as we've had, we need to bring our economic house, our house in economic order, and this is what all the European member states should be doing right now.
Mr. Barroso?
The question was about the future of energy policy. If I believe there will be one at European level, the answer is yes. Now, do you want me to develop? For that, we need several, because some matters are rather technical. But basically, what we need to have a common energy policy in Europe. When I mean common energy policy, I don't mean a fully integrated, harmonized, unified policy. This is something that we have to understand. We have 27 countries in Europe, very different. Sometimes the integration does not come from everyone doing exactly the same. For instance, there is a debate, as you know, in Europe about energy mix. Some countries have nuclear, others are absolutely opposed to nuclear. So the energy mix is a national competence. But what we can do, and in fact we are already doing, is to have some common lines. For that we need to, first of all, have an internal market for energy. Internal market. It means no artificial barriers. Until now, it was extremely difficult, for instance, the electricity from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spain, to come to France. And there are a lot. The Baltic countries were almost an energy island. And that's the first thing, to have a common market. The second issue is, of course, to have the infrastructure, because part of the problem is that there are not interconnections, for instance, in terms of gas. Now, after the crisis of supply we had with Russia and Ukraine, it was possible also to have reverse flows, and we are doing a lot. by the way, with European financing. I can tell you, if it was not European financing, we simply would not have this kind of infrastructure. Why? Because the governments and the politicians usually, they prefer to make some kind of investment that they can show to their population, even before elections. That's usually when they make those inaugurations, instead of having cross-border facilities or interconnections. So second issue is infrastructure. The third issue is some regulation. For instance, what we have done regarding climate. It was energy and climate package, the 2020 objectives. I was very proud to present it in the first commission I was chairing. And now it's already agreed legislation in Europe. So we are linking the energy file to the climate and environment file. For instance, for renewables. Now the Danish presidency is working hard to get the energy efficiency directive approved by member states. I can tell you it's not easy. Some of the governments are resisting the energy efficiency directive. So then we can have an energy efficiency, in energy security, a lot of more regulation that can at the same time make it improve our energy security and at the same time help us reach the goals of the climate protection, reducing greenhouse gas by 20%, have an increase of 20% energy efficiency, and hopefully have 20% at least of renewables in the mix of our energy content. So yes, I believe that's a sector where we are making progress, and I hope that the member states now, because of the crisis, are not going to drag their feet when it comes to more ambitious in terms of climate, because this is a way where we can also create jobs in the future, the green jobs in the future, if we commit to a climate and integrated also energy policy.
I cannot help it. I have one burning question. I must ask it. Before, when you hold your speeches, you were talking about EU as securing stability, peace, and everything. All the results we all know. But when you turn to the French election and you see people, they see the fiscal compound as a problem. See EU as a problem, not the solution. Then EU, even though you might be right, you're not supported, you do have an image problem. Can I ask the two of you, what will you do to solve the image problem of EU?
First of all, I'm not going to comment specifically on any elections in our member states, precisely because I respect different member states. What I can tell you is the following. We are living a real crisis, not only, by the way, in Europe. And what we see, if you want to be serious about the issue, not just to make propaganda, is that there is, in fact, a real problem of connection or lack of connection between the citizens, the normal citizens, and the elites, the political elites, at national level, at European level, but not only in political terms, also the financial elites, the bankers, and so on. And this is a very serious matter because this is exactly the fertile ground for populism, sometimes of extremism, including xenophobic forces. And we know that in Europe, not so many years ago, we had these devils, the devils of extremism, fascism, Nazism, xenophobic sentiments, racism in Europe.
And Sunday from
So we have to be serious about this. But to be frank, this is not a question just regarding the European institutions. On the contrary, if you look at the data of the surveys of public opinion, we see that sometimes the support for the European institution is much bigger than for national governments or for the parties. There is a real problem. Did you notice what happened in Italy and in Greece? That it was easier for the people to support reforms presented by governments of non-elected prime ministers than from the traditional parties. Wasn't it interesting? So the real problem is not a problem of the European Union as such. It's a problem of confidence of the people, the normal people, the people that are really afraid to lose their job, or young people that are afraid of not finding their first job. And then we recognize the problem. Then we are ready to work on everything that can increase our legitimacy and our support also, be it in terms of democratic reforms, in transparency. We have many reforms introduced now in the last European treaty, the Lisbon Treaty. I agree with Prime Minister Thorning-Schmidt. This is not always the time to create new institutions and new governments and new governance, but we can, inside the treaties, improve a lot on these matters. And so, yes, the honest answer to your question is, yes, I'm concerned. with the support or sometimes the lack of support to European idea in many of our quarters. But the honest answer is also, this can be overcome only if our leaders at national level believe that European project is not just something to do it in Brussels or in European Parliament in Strasbourg, but it is their project. That we have the governments at national level to explain what it is about, that the national parliaments discuss. Your parliament, I've just seen the public opinion in Europe. Your parliament is the best in Europe in terms of support. We have more support to your national parliament than the double of the usual parliaments in Europe. It's impressive because you have a great accountability in your system, and Denmark should be praised by that. But that's not the situation in all countries. In many of our member states, people have mistrust about even their own parliament, about their national politicians. And namely, they don't believe their politicians when sometimes they go to Brussels and they say, what a great success. And when things go well, they say it is their merit. When there are problems, they say it's the European Union's fault. This is not right. So what I want is everybody to assume this leadership. At the end, it's a question of leadership, of ownership, of responsibility. The European Union is not just Brussels. The European Union is all of us, and we can only overcome this gap that you are mentioning and that exists if together, at all levels, including, by the way, not only the politicians. That's why I'm here in a university. The institutions of the civil society, the social partners, trade unions or business associations, universities, intellectuals, all those that, and by the way, those that believe in some values have the courage to stand by them and say, yes, we want Europe. Yes, we don't want racism. Yes, we don't want xenophobia. We don't believe closing Europe is the best solution for our future.
Thank you very much. Helle Thorning-Schmidt.
When you talk about Europe having an image problem, I always feel it's too superfluous to talk about image, because what Europe has is a crisis. And what people have when they can't get a job and don't see the need for them to be part of society is a real crisis. We have an economic crisis in Europe, and the best we can do is for member states to do the necessary to create new growth. Part of that is consolidation of their economy. Member states have to own up to that responsibility. And they can't always look to Europe and say, solve our problems, because this is a member state issue to solve these kind of problems. At the European level, we can do a lot as well. And the only answer to the frustration when people can't get a job, when the economy is not going anywhere as it is now, is to try to solve problems. That is why the whole Danish presidency is about trying to solve problems, not talk about image, not talk about institutional changes, but to trying to make our internal market function, trying to create new trade agreements with the rest of the world, trying to make our budget focused on the next generation, which means more education, sustainable development. We need to try with the tools we have to solve problems, not talk only about an image problem, but to go for tangible results for the citizens of Europe. This is the answer. This has always been the answer, and is also the answer now.
Thank you very much. A moderator is a true failure when he does not hold the time. A meeting is a success if you want to continue it all the time. I hope you all stress the last thing. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for being patient, for all your good answers and good questions. Thank you very much.